The sun baked the cracked ground of Marlin Creek Estates, a place that had once been a shimmering promise of suburban paradise. Rows of identical beige houses stood like soldiers, their lawns dead from the drought that had stretched into its third merciless summer. A lone sprinkler sputtered somewhere, and the faint hiss of wasted water carried on the wind like a sin. Ethan Cole sat on his porch, watching the sky. It hadn't rained in 67 days. He counted them not because he wanted to, but because water had become the language of survival out here. The HOA called it regulation. Ethan called it control. A white envelope lay on the porch table, unopened but already accusing. The stamp of the Marlin Creek Homeowners Association gleamed on the corner, embossed and self-important. He'd known this was coming. Ethan tore it open with a dry thumb. The paper crackled. Notice of violation #734A, unauthorized water storage. Fine, $50,000. His jaw locked. $50,000. He kept reading, though his eyes burned hotter than the desert sun. Per HOA Bylaw Section 14.7, water collection and containment beyond the approved volume of 100 gallons constitutes hoarding, punishable by fines and/or legal action. They'd found the dam. The small, hand-built barrier in the ravine behind his house, a quiet pocket of salvation he'd carved over 3 years. When rain did come, it would trickle down into that dip and fill the makeshift pond. He'd used it to water his garden, to keep a few apple trees alive, to remind himself that life could still grow out here. Now the HOA called it illegal water possession. Ethan crumpled the letter. He stared toward the distant hills, where the faint shimmer of his dam would be hidden among dry brush and rocks. It wasn't much, but it was his. A piece of the land that still obeyed nature, not committee rules. That evening, the HOA's chairperson, Richard Haynes, showed up in his glossy white SUV. Ethan saw him coming from the kitchen window, the man's pressed blue shirt, his HOA badge gleaming like some kind of authority medal. Richard always carried himself like he was the mayor of Marlin Creek. Ethan met him at the gate. "Evening, Richard," Ethan said, trying to keep his voice even. "Ethan." Richard smiled tightly. "Got the letter, I assume?" "Got it." "You're serious about that number?" Richard sighed like a man forced into benevolence. "It's not personal, Ethan. It's about fairness. Everyone's suffering. You can't be the only one sitting on hundreds of gallons while the rest of us buy bottled water." "It's rainwater," Ethan said. "From my land." Richard's eyes hardened. "That's not how the bylaws see it. Water rights fall under collective management." Ethan's laugh came out bitter. "Collective management, huh? You mean the HOA board that installed a fountain at the entrance last year?" "That's different," Richard said quickly. "A community aesthetic decision." Ethan took a step closer. "You fine me 50 grand for saving water while your stupid fountain spits mist into thin air." Richard didn't flinch, though he looked uncomfortable. "You built an unregistered dam. That's a liability risk. We can't have runoff control in private hands." Ethan stared at him for a long, silent moment, the desert wind swirling dust between them. "Runoff control, huh?" he said quietly. "You just wait for runoff to stop. See what happens." Richard frowned. "What does that mean?" "Means you'll get your fairness," Ethan said. "Soon." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. The moonlight poured across his toolshed, glinting off metal shovels, wrenches, the big rusted crowbar he'd used when he built the dam's sluice gate. Every sound outside was amplified, the distant croak of a frog near his pond, the dry creak of a windmill that hadn't turned in months. He poured himself a glass of warm water, the last from his filtered jug. He stared at it a long time before drinking. He'd built the dam after his wife, Laura, left 2 years ago. She couldn't stand the dryness, the paranoia, the constant fighting with the HOA. "This place is killing you," she'd said before driving east. She was right, of course, but Ethan had stayed. He couldn't abandon the land. He used to be an engineer. Built irrigation systems before the state cut water rights and the jobs dried up. The dam was his quiet rebellion, his one good creation left. He went outside, the night air hot and still. He walked the narrow trail up the ridge, flashlight sweeping over cactus shadows. When he reached the top, he looked down on the small dam below, a crescent of stone and concrete, holding a shimmer of moonlit water. The frogs croaked. The cattails rustled. It was beautiful, in a lonely kind of way. And now they wanted to destroy it. The next morning, Ethan watched the HOA trucks arrive. 2 of them. White pickups with Marlin Creek Maintenance stenciled on the sides. A few workers in orange vests unloaded hoses and pumps. Richard Haynes stood at the edge of the ravine, clipboard in hand. Ethan came down from his porch slowly, heart pounding. "Morning, Ethan," Richard called. "We're just here to drain your illegal reservoir. Standard procedure before citation enforcement." Ethan's throat tightened. "You touched that dam, and you'll regret it." "Please don't make this harder," Richard said, signaling to his crew. "We're within our rights." The pump started with a roar, sucking the pond's clear water out into plastic containers. Ethan clenched his fists. The air felt heavier, the sun crueler. Then something inside him snapped. He walked away, calmly, quietly. Back to the shed. He grabbed his crowbar, the one that had built the gate, and slung it over his shoulder. By the time he returned, the workers had drained half the pond. Richard looked up just as Ethan stepped onto the dam. "Ethan, don't." But Ethan wasn't listening. He jammed the crowbar into the gate lock and wrenched. The metal screamed, the latch gave way, and the water surged. It wasn't much, not a flood, but enough. The sudden torrent burst down the ravine, sweeping over the pumps, knocking a worker off his feet. Richard stumbled back, shouting. The water spilled out, free again. Free of control, of bylaws, of HOA arrogance. Ethan dropped the crowbar. It clanged against the rocks. Richard shouted, "You'll pay for this, Cole. That's destruction of property." Ethan turned, the sun blazing behind him, and said quietly, "Nature doesn't pay fines, Richard. It collects them." That night, the HOA put out an emergency notice, unauthorized water release, damage under assessment. They promised lawsuits, inspections, and retribution. But Ethan didn't care. He stood on his porch again, listening to the frogs now croaking somewhere far down the ravine, where the water had spread, soaking into long dry earth. Something had been awakened. And deep down, Ethan knew this was only the beginning. The next morning, Marlin Creek Estates woke to a strange kind of quiet. At first glance, everything looked the same, the beige houses with their lifeless lawns, the cracked streets reflecting the early sun. But Ethan knew better. The dam had changed the neighborhood's rhythm. That water, once trapped and silent, was moving again, and it wasn't obeying anyone's rules. Ethan stepped onto his porch, breathing in the faint, earthy scent of wet soil. He had slept poorly, haunted by dreams of rushing water tearing through the streets, taking no prisoners. Not that he feared lawsuits or fines anymore, the money was meaningless compared to the principle. And the law of nature, he realized, was far older and far more relentless than any HOA regulation. Down in the ravine, he saw it, a winding stream cutting through the dry brush. The surge of water had carved a small channel, spilling over into patches of previously barren soil. Tiny seedlings, parched and desperate, were already sprouting. It was subtle, almost invisible, but it was proof that life would find a way. Ethan felt a surge of satisfaction, mixed with an almost primal thrill. He had started something. Something bigger than himself. By noon, the HOA was in full panic mode. Richard Haynes, red-faced and clutching his clipboard like a shield, barked orders at his crew. "Contain it. Pump it back. Do something. This is unprecedented." But the water wasn't behaving. Pumps sputtered. Hoses kinked and burst. Even the hired landscapers' trucks became mired in mud where the soil had soaked up the unexpected torrent. Richard stomped toward Ethan's property line, clipboard shaking. "Cole! You're a menace. Do you realize what this is? We could lose houses, landscaping, streets. You'll pay for this. Ethan leaned against the porch railing, calm but cold. I already paid, Richard. With every drop I let go. Nature takes its toll, you just have to watch and learn. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. There was nothing to argue against that. And Ethan knew it. Across Marlin Creek Estates, things began to shift in small, eerie ways. Sidewalks that had been baked and brittle began to crack and buckle as the hidden water table shifted. Lawns that had long since turned brown started to show faint hints of green. Tiny streams formed along the streets, weaving past mailboxes and driveways, as though the neighborhood itself was reclaiming what had been stolen. By the afternoon, the HOA received its first formal complaints, not from Ethan, but from the residents themselves. Margaret Lyle, an elderly woman who prided herself on her perfectly trimmed hedge, was on the phone screaming. Richard! My hedge! The water, it's flooding my property. Do something. Richard slammed the phone down. It's Ethan. That man's gone beyond reason. He's a lunatic. But even Richard knew, deep down, this wasn't entirely Ethan's doing. He hadn't built a flood, he'd only released water. The rest, well, nature had its own agenda. As the HOA scrambled, Ethan wandered down the ravine to inspect the progress. The stream had cut a small canyon where none had existed before. Rocks that had been immovable for decades were shifted. The old creek bed, long dry, was awakening like a buried giant. He watched as water carved intricate patterns into the soil, forming pools that reflected the sky. Tiny fish, probably carried downstream from distant sources, darted through the shallows. Birds, long absent from the estate, returned cautiously, hopping along the edges of the water. Ethan felt a strange kinship with them, the survivors, like him, claiming life where bureaucracy and drought had tried to snuff it out. Then came the sound, a low, rumbling growl from upstream. At first, Ethan thought it was the wind or distant construction. But no. The water itself seemed to be moving faster, heavier. The dam, the little gate he had ripped open, was holding, but just barely. A sudden surge knocked him off his feet. He scrambled to regain balance. The water wasn't just moving downhill. It was gathering strength. Meanwhile, the HOA board convened an emergency meeting in the clubhouse. The air conditioning struggled to compete with the desert heat, and tension made the room feel hotter still. Richard paced. We need to sue him. Immediately, he said, slapping the clipboard against the table. $50,000 isn't enough. This man is a threat to the entire community. Threat, another board member, Janice Bell, protested. He hasn't harmed anyone. He just released water. That's exactly the problem. Richard barked. Uncontrolled water is chaos. Look outside, streets are flooded, people's properties are affected. If he gets away with this, others will follow. Janice swallowed nervously. But the plants are growing. The lawns are greener. Even the small creek is forming, maybe this is good for the environment. Richard's glare froze her in place. Environment? We're not running a wildlife sanctuary. We're homeowners. Rules exist for a reason. Ethan, oblivious to the meeting, watched the water do what it was meant to do. It surged downstream, splitting into tributaries that snaked through the dry streets. Fences that had once been rigid barriers were now partially submerged. The HOA's maintenance vehicles groaned and slipped in the mud, their engines straining. He paused to notice something. A family had come out to watch. Children waded in shallow pools, laughing at the sudden bounty of life in their dusty neighborhood. Adults, though wary, smiled at the unexpected greenery. Ethan realized then that he hadn't just freed water, he'd freed hope. And that terrified the HOA even more than the flooding. By late afternoon, the situation escalated. A section of the main road collapsed where the water had undermined the pavement. The HOA dispatched contractors, but trucks got stuck in mud, and one nearly toppled into the burgeoning stream. Richard's voice on the radio was sharp, frenzied, barking orders as if sheer willpower could control the chaos. Ethan stood atop his porch, watching, feeling the weight of quiet satisfaction. This was bigger than any legal battle. This was natural justice in motion, slow, unstoppable, and undeniable. He thought of Laura, far away in another state, living in neat subdivisions where rules always trumped life. She had never understood why he stayed. But now, he whispered to himself, you don't need to understand. You just need to watch. The water gleamed in the evening sun, wild and free. The HOA's authority was meaningless against it. Their letters, fines, and threats were scraps in the face of torrents and soil, mud and rain. Nature didn't negotiate. Nature didn't compromise. Nature took. That night, Ethan sat by the edge of the ravine, listening to the gurgling water. The neighborhood slept fitfully, disturbed by the sound of flowing streams where once there had been only dry, dead silence. Somewhere downstream, a street lamp flickered in a pool of mud, electric and impermanent. He knew the HOA would retaliate. They would send lawyers, write letters, and perhaps even call the police. But he also knew this: the water had already done its work. It had reawakened life, unsettled authority, and reminded the residents that not all control could be bought or imposed. Ethan sipped from his glass, now tasting not just water, but victory. Not legal victory, not personal revenge, but something purer, wilder, more satisfying. Nature had been patient. And now, it had reclaimed its power. The dawn arrived like a curtain of fire over Marlin Creek Estates. Sunlight streaked across rooftops and cracked streets, illuminating a neighborhood that no longer resembled the controlled, beige-perfect paradise it had once been. Pools of water reflected the sky in shattered mosaics along lawns and sidewalks. Birds returned in flocks, chirping in uneasy glee, and the air smelled of mud, grass, and the faint metallic scent of electricity, the aroma of a place reborn. Ethan Cole stepped out onto his porch with a thermos of coffee in hand, watching the results of his rebellion. The dam, his creation, had held strong. Downstream, water carved new channels through the streets, rejuvenating parched soil and overturning rigid landscaping. The HOA's earlier attempts to contain it had failed spectacularly. Pumps lay half-submerged. Hoses were twisted like discarded snakes. A contractor's truck slumped into a mud pit, wheels spinning futilely as their radio crackled with frantic reports. Ethan smiled. Nature had a way of settling scores far better than any courtroom ever could. By mid-morning, Richard Haynes, red-faced and desperate, stormed into Ethan's property. He had brought reinforcements, 2 police officers, a contractor with chainsaws, and a few board members who looked like they had slept on hedges. Their steps sank into the mud as they approached the porch. "Cole! This ends today!" Richard shouted, waving a legal folder like a weapon. "We're taking you to court. This is destruction of property, public endangerment, and..." "Destruction?" Ethan interrupted, his voice calm, almost hypnotic. "You mean freeing water? Giving life back to dry earth? The same earth your bylaws try to control and suffocate?" Richard's jaw tightened. "You're crazy. This neighborhood could collapse. People could get hurt. You could be arrested." "And yet," Ethan said, gesturing to the ravine below, "here we all stand. Everyone is alive. Nobody drowned. Nature handled what you call chaos far better than your rules ever could." Richard opened his mouth again but was cut off by a sudden, guttural rumble. From the ravine below, the water surged faster, growing in strength as though aware of the tension above. The small creek that had been a trickle overnight was now a roaring river, spreading through streets, overflowing lawns, and washing away gravel paths and plastic barriers. The police officers and board members took instinctive steps back. Richard's face went pale. This isn't possible," he muttered, his clipboard trembling. "It's just water, controlled, regulated." Ethan shook his head. "It's never been about control, Richard. It's about respect. For life, for the land, for balance. Something you clearly forgot." Elsewhere in Marlin Creek Estates, residents began emerging cautiously. Margaret Lyle, her hedge now partially submerged, watched children splash through the water, laughing for the first time in months. She shook her fist at the board members but couldn't hide a smile. Janice Bell stood near the overflowing fountain at the entrance, realizing that what had seemed like a disaster was quietly revitalizing their homes. Lawns turned faintly green. Soil softened. Birds returned. Even some of the more rigid homeowners approached Ethan, curiosity overtaking fear. They asked quietly, Who can stop this? Ethan simply shook his head. No one. Not the HOA. Not the board. Not lawyers. Only nature. And nature, it seemed, had chosen its side. By noon, the situation had escalated into full-blown chaos for the HOA. Streets were impassable. The clubhouse had partial flooding. The maintenance vehicles were mired in mud, engine hoods caked with soil. Richard Haynes, realizing the futility, called an emergency meeting of his own board in the clubhouse. We need to call the city, he said, pacing like a trapped animal. This is a disaster. Cole should be arrested. Fine him. Something. Janice Bell, her hands dirty from trying to save her flower beds, looked him in the eye. Richard, look around. This isn't a disaster. It's life. The drought is over for our little neighborhood. People's gardens are alive again. Water is moving. This is good. Richard's face contorted in disbelief. Good? You call this good? Ethan appeared at the doorway of the clubhouse, mud-streaked and calm. Good? Look outside. That's good. You've been holding life hostage while quoting bylaws. Now you see what happens when nature decides to reclaim it. Richard's voice rose, almost hysterical. You can't just. Watch, Ethan said, cutting him off. He pointed downstream. A flash flood of water gushed past the cul-de-sac, twisting over the street and into the dry, barren parts of the neighborhood that had been long forgotten. Trees that had appeared dead for years soaked in the water, their leaves trembling as new life surged through them. Even Richard could not ignore it. The city streets beyond Marlin Creek Estates might not have known it yet, but the neighborhood was alive in a way no regulation could have produced. By late afternoon, the HOA was forced to concede, at least temporarily. Richard, drenched and defeated, signed a document drafted by the city engineer, agreeing to halt any legal actions against Ethan until the water receded and assessments could be made. It wasn't a full victory, not yet, but it was enough. Enough to show that sometimes, the law bows to the irrepressible force of nature. Ethan walked down the ravine, letting the water lap against his boots, feeling the mud squish between his toes. He thought of Laura, who had always feared his stubbornness. Maybe she still did, maybe she never understood. But he didn't need her understanding. He had the water, he had the soil, and he had justice raw, undeniable, and wild. As evening fell, the neighborhood transformed into something else entirely. Pools and streams reflected the golden sky. Children ran through shallow currents, splashing mud on their parents' clean shoes, laughing at the absurdity of it all. Birds flitted from tree to tree. Even the HOA board sat on their soaked porch steps, unable to do anything but watch, humbled. Ethan stood on his porch, watching the sun sink behind the hills. The water below continued to flow freely, singing a quiet song of rebellion and rebirth. He whispered to himself. Rules can't contain life. Fines can't stop it. And nature always has the final word. For the first time in years, Ethan felt truly free. And he knew, deep down, that Marlin Creek Estates had been changed forever not just by water, but by the courage to let the unstoppable course of nature dictate justice. The neighborhood would heal, slowly, painfully, but vibrantly. And the HOA? They had learned a lesson they would never forget: no one owns nature. No one controls it. And the smallest action, the release of a little water, could topple the illusion of authority faster than any lawsuit ever could. Ethan turned away from the water, the sun dipping low in the sky, and walked into the night mud-streaked, victorious, and finally at peace.